She was only a young girl, a child who loved to draw, who adored her father, and who dreamed of a life filled with joy and love. Elisa Izquierdo had her whole life ahead of her, yet her name is now etched into history as the face of one of the most gut-wrenching failures of New York's child protection system. Her story isn't just tragic. It's unthinkable. Born in 1989 to Gustavo Izquierdo, a Cuban immigrant, and Awilda Lopez, Elisa's life began with promise. Her father, a loving and devoted man, made it his mission to give her every opportunity for a bright future. Despite financial hardships, Gustavo ensured Elisa knew she was deeply loved. But the fairy tale ended when Elisa's father passed away, and Elisa's father, leaving her in the custody of her mother, a woman whose struggles with substance abuse and mental health issues had already cast dark shadows over her life. The transition to her mother's care marked the beginning of a horrifying descent. What should have been a sanctuary became a prison, and Elisa, a little girl full of potential, became trapped in a cycle of abuse that would ultimately take her life. Despite the bruises, the tears, and the cries for help, the warnings were ignored. Child services visited but never intervened. Teachers reported signs of abuse, but the system failed to act. Elisa's story is not just about a child lost. It's about a system that looked away when it mattered most. On November 22, 1995, Elisa's small Brooklyn apartment became the scene of unimaginable horror. What investigators found inside would haunt them forever. A child's body broken, her spirit extinguished. It was a crime that shook the city to its core, leaving everyone asking the same question. How did we let this happen? How did no one see the warning signs? And why, in a city so full of people, was Elisa left to face this nightmare alone? This story is more than a case. It's a reckoning. Elisa's death isn't just a tragedy. It's a mirror held up to society, reflecting every blind eye turned and every voice silenced. Tonight, we will retrace Elisa's steps, uncover the systemic failures that led to her death, and hear the haunting words of those who tried and failed to save her. This is the story of Elisa Izquierdo, an innocent child whose life was stolen, not just by one person, but by a system that refused to see her. Brooklyn, New York, 1995. A borough that stood as a microcosm of America's diversity. Its streets hummed with life, a patchwork of families striving to carve out their place in the bustling city. Amidst this energy, hidden within the walls of a modest apartment building, lived a young girl whose story would become a chilling testament to systemic failure. Elisa loved to draw. Her colorful pictures often depicted happy families, bright suns, and houses filled with laughter, images that stood in stark contrast to the reality that would come to define her life. To those who knew her, Elisa was a beacon of innocence and joy, a little girl with big dreams that should have been nurtured and protected. Elisa was born to Gustavo Izquierdo, a Cuban immigrant who arrived in America with dreams of a better life. Gustavo worked tirelessly to provide for Elisa, ensuring she never felt the weight of his financial struggles. In his eyes, Elisa was everything good and pure in the world, a gift he cherished above all else. Her early years were filled with love and stability, a life Gustavo fought to give her despite the odds stacked against them. But on the other side of Elisa's family was her mother, Awilda Lopez. Awilda's life was marred by substance abuse and turbulent relationships, a past that often bled into her present. Though her struggles were evident, Gustavo hoped Elisa could bridge the gap, believing that even Awilda's love for their daughter might triumph over her demons. For a time, Elisa's life seemed to follow the trajectory of her father's dreams. But everything changed in 1994 when tragedy struck. Gustavo Izquierdo, the man who had been Elisa's rock, passed away unexpectedly, leaving Elisa's custody in question. Despite objections from family members and community advocates, the court ruled that Elisa would be placed in the care of her biological mother, Awilda Lopez. This decision would prove to be the turning point in Elisa's life, a decision that would place her on a path of unimaginable pain and suffering. Awilda, burdened by her addiction and unstable lifestyle, quickly became overwhelmed with the responsibilities of motherhood. What should have been a new chapter filled with hope and healing became a descent into neglect, abuse, and tragedy. The signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. Elisa's cheerful demeanor began to fade. Teachers noticed bruises on her arms and changes in her behavior. Neighbors heard shouting from inside the apartment, and Elisa's once luminous eyes grew dull. Reports were made to Child Protective Services, but time and time again, Elisa slipped through the cracks. How does a system designed to protect children like Elisa fail so catastrophically? As the weeks turned into months, Elisa's life spiraled further into chaos, setting the stage for a tragedy that would shock not only Brooklyn, but the entire nation. For months, the small Brooklyn apartment where Elisa Izquierdo lived with her mother, Awilda Lopez, hid a grim reality. The young girl, once vibrant and full of life, had become a prisoner in her own home. The walls that should have provided safety became witnesses to unspeakable cruelty. What unfolded behind closed doors was a pattern of abuse so harrowing it defies comprehension. The signs were there, evident to anyone who looked closely. Elisa's teachers were among the first to notice. Bruises appeared on her small arms and legs, marks that didn't align with the playful accidents of childhood. Elisa, once bubbly and engaged in class, became withdrawn, her laughter replaced by a haunting silence. Her drawings, once filled with bright colors, took on a darker tone, as if reflecting the turmoil she could not voice. Neighbors, too, began to hear unsettling sounds, muffled cries, the sound of shouting, and loud thuds coming from the apartment. Some were brave enough to report their concerns to Child Protective Services, but their calls were met with inaction. Reports piled up, but no decisive action was taken to remove Elisa from her mother's care. Despite these warnings, Elisa remained with Awilda. The abuse escalated, becoming more frequent and severe. Awilda Lopez, consumed by her own demons, directed her anger and frustration at Elisa in unimaginable ways. Witness accounts and later investigations revealed that Elisa was subjected to beatings, humiliation, and deprivation. She was denied basic necessities like food and water as punishment for minor offenses, or simply because Awilda was in a rage. In the weeks leading up to Elisa's death, the signs of neglect and abuse became impossible to ignore. Yet every cry for help went unanswered. The system that should have intervened failed her at every turn. On November 22, 1995, the abuse reached its devastating conclusion. That evening, Elisa endured what would be her final punishment. Reports later revealed that Awilda, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, brutally beat Elisa, slamming her small body against the floor repeatedly until she lost consciousness. Elisa, already frail from months of neglect and physical torment, could not survive the attack. When emergency responders arrived, the scene they walked into was one that would haunt them forever. Elisa lay lifeless on the floor of the apartment, surrounded by signs of prolonged suffering. Her body bore the marks of months, perhaps years of abuse. The reality of what had taken place inside those walls shocked even the most seasoned investigator. But what authorities discovered inside the apartment was far more than just the aftermath of a brutal assault. The evidence of Elisa's prolonged suffering, the missed opportunities to save her, would send shockwaves through the community and spark outrage across the nation. How had so many people failed to see the signs? And what happened to Elisa in her final days that no one intervened to stop? And when police entered the small Brooklyn apartment on November 22, 1995, they were met with a scene that would remain etched in their memories forever. The air inside was heavy, thick with neglect and despair. The floors were covered in grime, the walls bore stains of a chaotic and violent environment, and in the middle of it all was the lifeless body of young Elisa Izquierdo, lying on the cold, hard floor. Her small frame told the story of months, if not years, of unimaginable pain and suffering. The apartment was more than just a crime scene. It was a physical manifestation of the horrors Elisa endured. Investigators described it as filthy, cluttered, and devoid of any sign of a nurturing home. Among the scattered belongings and trash were objects that would later become crucial pieces of evidence: a blood-stained mop, a broken piece of wood, and other items that hinted at the tools of abuse. The stark contrast between the innocence of the child who had lived there and the deplorable conditions of her environment was overwhelming. Forensic teams carefully documented every detail, knowing that each piece of evidence would help unravel the tragic final chapter of Elisa's life. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to Elisa's death, key evidence began to emerge. The medical examiner's report was damning, revealing the full extent of the abuse Elisa had suffered. Her body bore signs of repeated trauma, bruises in various stages of healing, scars from older wounds, and internal injuries that painted a horrifying picture of prolonged violence. Equally chilling were the testimonies from neighbors and school officials. They described hearing Elisa's cries late at night and seeing her visibly bruised on multiple occasions. One neighbor recounted hearing Elisa plead, "Please stop, Mommy," on more than one occasion. These cries for help, though reported to authorities, had gone unaddressed. The turning point in the investigation came when Awilda Lopez, Elisa's mother, was taken into custody. Initially, she denied any wrongdoing, claiming Elisa had fallen or accidentally hurt herself. But as evidence mounted and the weight of the interrogation bore down on her, Awilda confessed to the abuse. Her admission sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Awilda described, in chilling detail, the escalating acts of violence she inflicted on her daughter. She admitted to beating Elisa, withholding food, and subjecting her to psychological torment. Most hauntingly, she described the final moments of Elisa's life. How, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, she had slammed Elisa's head against the floor repeatedly until her small body went limp. For seasoned detectives, Awilda's confession was almost too much to bear. Even those accustomed to the darkest sides of humanity were shaken by the sheer brutality of the acts she described. One detective would later say, "I've seen a lot in my years on the force, but this was something different. This was pure, unthinkable evil." The investigation didn't just focus on the crime itself. It also sought to understand how Elisa had fallen through the cracks of the system meant to protect her. Reports from Child Protective Services revealed a trail of missed opportunities. Multiple calls had been made about Elisa's welfare, each one ignored or dismissed as inconsequential. A failure to act at critical junctures allowed the abuse to escalate unchecked. For investigators, the evidence painted a devastating picture of systemic neglect. Elisa's death wasn't just the result of one person's actions. It was the culmination of a series of failures that allowed a vulnerable child to be placed in harm's way repeatedly. The arrest of Awilda Lopez marked the beginning of the legal battle to seek justice for Elisa Izquierdo. While the investigation had uncovered the horrifying details of Elisa's life and death, the courtroom would become the stage where her story was retold in painful, graphic detail. It was here that the weight of Elisa's short, tragic life would be laid bare for the world to see. Following her confession, Awilda Lopez was formally arrested and charged with second-degree murder and multiple counts of child abuse. The severity of the charges reflected not only the horrific nature of Elisa's death, but also the prolonged suffering she endured leading up to that fateful day. For the prosecution, the case was not just about punishing a single individual, but also about sending a message that such atrocities would not go unanswered. As Awilda was led away in handcuffs, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their cameras capturing the moment. Outside, a growing crowd of neighbors, parents, and activists held signs demanding justice for Elisa. Among them were people who had reported Awilda's abuse but had been ignored, a stark reminder of the system's failure to protect Elisa. The trial began in early 1996, drawing national attention to both Elisa's story and the broader failures of the child welfare system. The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members, and concerned citizens, all seeking to understand how such a tragedy could occur. Over the course of several weeks, prosecutors presented their case with chilling precision, recounting the abuse Elisa endured and the missed opportunities to save her. The prosecution's witnesses included neighbors, teachers, and social workers, all of whom shared emotional testimonies about their encounters with Elisa and their attempts to intervene. One teacher broke down in tears as she described Elisa's bruises and her withdrawn demeanor, saying, "We tried to get help for her, but no one listened." A neighbor testified about hearing Elisa's cries late at night, her voice trembling as she said, "I still hear her begging for her life." Perhaps the most heart-wrenching testimony came from Elisa's extended family. Her aunt, who had pleaded for custody after Gustavo's death, spoke directly to the court. "I begged them not to send her to Awilda. I knew this would happen. I knew Elisa would not survive there." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the tragedy's preventability. The defense sought to shift the focus away from Elisa and onto Awilda's troubled past. Her attorneys argued that Awilda's actions were the result of years of trauma, substance abuse, and mental health struggles. They painted a picture of a woman who was herself a victim, claiming she lacked the capacity to care for Elisa due to her untreated condition. Psychologists were brought in to testify about Awilda's history of abuse at the hands of her own parents and her long battle with addiction. The defense's argument was clear. Awilda's past had shaped her into a woman incapable of making rational decisions, and the system had failed not only Elisa but Awilda as well. But the jury remained unconvinced. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the deliberate and sustained nature of the abuse. pointing out that Awilda had opportunities to seek help, but chose instead to take out her anger on her daughter. This was not a moment of weakness, the prosecutor argued. This was a pattern of violence and cruelty that Awilda Lopez inflicted on an innocent child, knowing full well what she was doing. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict: guilty of second-degree murder and child abuse. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman read the decision, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Outside, the crowd erupted in a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that Awilda would face justice, but sorrow that it had come too late to save Elisa. At the sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a powerful statement, acknowledging the systemic failures that contributed to Elisa's death while condemning Awilda's actions. "This court recognizes the pain and suffering that Elisa endured," the judge said. "Her death is a tragedy that could have and should have been prevented. But the responsibility for her death rests squarely on your shoulders, Miss Lopez." Elisa Lopez was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, a punishment that many felt was inadequate for the severity of her crimes. For Elisa's family and supporters, the sentence was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Elisa back. Elisa Izquierdo's death was not just a heartbreaking tragedy. It became a rallying cry for systemic reform. The glaring failures in New York's child welfare system that allowed Elisa to remain in an abusive environment despite multiple warning signs forced lawmakers and advocates to take immediate action. Her case was the tipping point, a moment that could no longer be ignored. In 1996, in direct response to her death, Elisa's Law was enacted. This landmark legislation aimed to overhaul the child welfare system, introducing measures designed to prevent future tragedies. Among its provisions was increased accountability for caseworkers, mandatory documentation of every interaction with at-risk families, and greater transparency in cases involving child fatalities. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the law was the allowance of public access to certain child welfare records when systemic failures were involved, a measure that many felt was necessary to ensure accountability but sparked debates about privacy. The law also mandated enhanced training for social workers, equipping them with the tools to identify and intervene in cases of abuse more effectively. Additionally, it created new protocols for follow-ups on reported cases, ensuring that children like Elisa wouldn't slip through the cracks of bureaucracy again. It was a step forward, but for many, it came too late. Advocates hailed the law as a critical step in addressing systemic failures. For years, child welfare agencies had operated under a veil of secrecy, their internal mistakes shielded from public scrutiny. Elisa's Law forced the system to confront its own shortcomings, bringing much-needed accountability to an institution tasked with protecting the most vulnerable. It was a painful but necessary reckoning. Still, the changes brought about by Elisa's Law did not come without resistance. Critics argued that increased transparency could discourage social workers from taking on high-risk cases for fear of public backlash. Others worried that public access to records might violate the privacy of surviving family members. These debates underscored the complexities of balancing accountability with compassion. But for those who had fought to pass Elisa's Law, the choice was clear. No child's life should be lost to bureaucratic inertia. While lawmakers worked to implement systemic changes, the community's response was immediate and deeply emotional. Elisa's death had struck a nerve, igniting a wave of grief and anger that reverberated far beyond Brooklyn. Candlelight vigils were held across New York City, drawing hundreds of people who came together to mourn the loss of a little girl they had never met, but whose story felt achingly personal. At these vigils, parents held their children close as speakers shared memories of Elisa and the lessons her death had taught. One speaker, a teacher who had reported signs of abuse but saw no action taken, tearfully addressed the crowd. "We failed her. I failed her. We all have to do better." Her words resonated deeply, capturing the collective guilt and determination of a community grappling with its role in Elisa's tragedy. Protests soon followed, with activists gathering outside the offices of Child Protective Services to demand accountability. Signs reading "Justice for Elisa" and "Stop Failing Our Children" filled the streets. Protesters chanted slogans like "Never Again" as they called for immediate reforms to protect at-risk children. For many, these protests were not just about Elisa. They were about ensuring that no other child would suffer the same fate. The protests and vigils served as more than just outlets for grief. They were catalysts for a broader national conversation about child abuse and systemic neglect. News outlets covered Elisa's story extensively, forcing the public to confront uncomfortable truths about the cracks in the systems designed to protect children. For weeks, Elisa's name and photograph were everywhere, a haunting reminder of a life lost too soon. Over time, Elisa's story became a symbol of both profound loss and enduring hope. Schools, community centers, and advocacy organizations adopted her story as a rallying cry for vigilance and reform. Child abuse prevention programs were expanded, and community outreach efforts grew stronger, with a focus on empowering neighbors, teachers, and caregivers to report signs of abuse, and to ensure those reports were acted upon. Elisa's death also led to an increase in public awareness about the importance of intervening in suspected cases of abuse. Helplines reported a surge in calls from concerned neighbors and family members, many of whom cited Elisa's story as their motivation to speak up. While her life had been tragically short, her impact was immeasurable. Elisa Izquierdo's story is not one of just tragedy, it is a cautionary tale and a call to action. Her death serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the ones who should protect us the most become the ones we fear the most. But her legacy is also one of resilience and hope, a testament to the power of her story to inspire change. As her aunt tearfully said during a vigil, Elisa should be here today. She should be laughing, playing, and dreaming. But she's not. And that is why we must keep fighting. We owe it to Elisa and to every child like her to ensure this never happens again. Those words, spoken in grief, became a rallying cry for reform and accountability. Elisa's life was cut tragically short, but her story has become a beacon for those fighting to protect vulnerable children. It challenges us to look inward, to ask whether we are doing enough, and to recognize the weight of our collective responsibility. Elisa's legacy reminds us that every child deserves to be seen, heard, and protected. Her story, though heartbreaking, serves as a powerful reminder of what is possible when tragedy inspires change. It reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, we have the power to make the world safer for the most vulnerable among us. And in doing so, we honor Elisa's memory, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of hope and transformation. Elisa Izquierdo's story is one that raises as many questions as it answers. At every turn, there were signs, warnings that something was terribly wrong, but at each critical juncture, those signs were overlooked, dismissed, or ignored. How did this happen, and why was Elisa returned to her mother, despite the clear and growing evidence of danger? These questions haunted everyone involved, and their answers are as troubling as the tragedy itself. The question of why Elisa was returned to her mother lies at the heart of this devastating case. When Elisa's father, Gustavo Izquierdo, passed away, there was no question that her life would change forever. Gustavo had been her protector, her source of love and stability. Without him, the courts faced the unenviable task of determining who would care for Elisa. But in hindsight, their decision would prove catastrophic. Awilda Lopez, Elisa's biological mother, petitioned for custody despite her history of substance abuse and erratic behavior. Family members, including Elisa's aunt, begged the courts not to grant Awilda custody, citing her unfitness as a parent. They pointed to her struggles with addiction and the volatile environment she had created in her own home. But despite these warnings, the court prioritized the biological connection between mother and child over the well-documented risks. It was a decision steeped in the assumption that biological parents, no matter their shortcomings, are inherently better suited to raise their children. This bias, though well-meaning, ignored the reality of Awilda's instability and placed Elisa in harm's way. The question remains, why were the voices of those who knew Awilda best, her family, ignored? And why did the system prioritize process over protection? This decision was more than a legal misstep. It was a life-altering mistake that would set the stage for Elisa's tragic final chapter. It forces us to ask, how many other children have been placed in dangerous situations because of similar assumptions? And how can we ensure that future decisions prioritize a child's safety over outdated notions of family ties? The warnings were there, dozens of them. Teachers, neighbors, and even strangers reported their concerns about Elisa's well-being to Child Protective Services. They described bruises, drastic changes in her behavior, and the chilling sounds of her cries late at night. But time and time again, these reports were dismissed as inconclusive or insufficient to warrant intervention. In one particularly haunting instance, Elisa's teacher filed a report detailing the visible bruises on her arms and her increasingly withdrawn demeanor in class. The teacher pleaded with social workers to investigate, but the case was closed after a cursory visit to the apartment. Social workers noted that Elisa appeared shy but otherwise fine, ignoring the clear signs of fear and trauma. Another report from a neighbor who overheard Elisa's cries went similarly unheeded, with officials citing a lack of corroborating evidence. At the heart of these failures was a broken system stretched to its limits. Overworked and undertrained social workers were tasked with making life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information, but even so, the question lingers. Could Elisa's life have been saved if just one call, just one, had been taken seriously? The answer is as heartbreaking as it is infuriating. For many, the answer is yes. Elisa's teacher, whose report went unanswered, later told reporters, "If they had listened, she would still be here. I have no doubt about that." It is a sentiment shared by neighbors, family members, and child advocates who believe that Elisa's death was not inevitable, but preventable. They are indictments of a system that failed Elisa at every turn. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that her death was not the result of one person's actions, but a series of failures that compounded over time. From the court's decision to grant custody to Awilda, to the unanswered cries for help, every misstep played a role in the tragedy that unfolded. And yet, these questions remain unanswered for far too many children. Elisa's story, though singular in its heartbreak, is emblematic of a larger issue. One that requires us to ask, how many more children must we lose before real change is achieved? And how can we ensure that their voices are heard before it is too late? The questions surrounding Elisa Izquierdo's death are ones we must continue to ask, not just to honor her memory, but to prevent history from repeating itself. Because while we cannot change the past, we have the power to shape the future. And that future must be one where no child's cry for help goes unanswered. Before her name became synonymous with tragedy, Elisa Izquierdo was just a little girl with big dreams. She loved to draw. Her crayons were always scattered across the table, creating colorful depictions of a world filled with happiness and love. Her favorite subject was her family, often drawing pictures of her father holding her hand, surrounded by bright suns and blooming flowers. In Elisa's eyes, the world was a place of possibility, and she believed, as all children do, that she was safe within it. Her laughter was infectious, a soft, melodic sound that echoed through her small classroom. Teachers often described her as cheerful and eager to learn, always the first to raise her hand and the last to put away her books. Elisa had dreams that extended far beyond her Brooklyn neighborhood. She once told her father she wanted to be a teacher when she grew up, inspired by the kind women who helped her learn to read and write. But her favorite dream was simpler, to one day live in a house where her whole family could be together again, just like in her drawing. But beneath the surface of Elisa's bright smile lay a vulnerability that only her father seemed to truly understand. Gustavo Izquierdo knew the world was not as safe as his daughter believed, and he worked tirelessly to shield her from its harsh realities. To him, Elisa was a gift, a beacon of hope in his otherwise difficult life. He often told friends, "Everything I do for her." Elisa was not just his daughter, she was his purpose. When Gustavo Izquierdo passed away unexpectedly in 1994, the stability that had defined Elisa's early years crumbled. Her father's death was not just a personal loss for Elisa. It was the loss of her protector, her confidant, and her greatest advocate. For Gustavo's extended family, the thought of Elisa living without her father was unbearable. But what followed was even more devastating. The court's decision to place Elisa in the custody of her mother, Awilda Lopez, left the family heartbroken and powerless. Gustavo's sister, who had petitioned for custody, recalled begging the judge to reconsider. "I told them she wasn't safe," she said through tears. "I told them Awilda couldn't take care of her, but they wouldn't listen. They said she belonged with her mother." For the community, the loss of Elisa felt deeply personal. Neighbors who had watched her play on the street and classmates who had shared lunch with her struggled to comprehend how such a bright and joyful child could be taken so soon. At her funeral, her teacher spoke softly to the mourners, saying, "She was the light in our classroom. She deserved so much more than this." For Gustavo's family, the grief was compounded by guilt and frustration. They had fought to protect Elisa, to give her a chance at a better life, but their voices had been drowned out by a system that prioritized paperwork over people. "We failed her," her aunt said. "We all failed her." Elisa's death forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about accountability and inevitability. Was her death the result of a broken system, or was it inevitable given the circumstances she was born into? And if the system is to blame, who within it bears the weight of that responsibility? Child Protective Services received multiple reports about Elisa's welfare. Reports from teachers, neighbors, and even strangers who sensed something was wrong. Yet, time and time again, these reports were dismissed as insufficient evidence. Social workers visited her home but failed to see through Awilda's facade of calm composure. Judges made custody decisions based on outdated assumptions about the sanctity of biological ties, ignoring the warnings of family members who knew the danger Elisa faced. But the blame does not rest solely with the system. It extends to the community, the neighbors who heard her cries but didn't press harder, the teachers who felt something was wrong but didn't know how to escalate their concerns. It extends to all of us, as a society, for allowing such a tragedy to occur in plain sight. Elisa's death is a sobering reminder of the fragility of childhood and the collective responsibility we bear to protect it. It forces us to ask, how many other children are living in silence, their cries unheard, their suffering unseen? And what will it take for us to truly listen, to act, and to prevent another tragedy like Elisa's? Elisa Izquierdo's life was filled with potential, with dreams that should have been nurtured and protected. Her death was not inevitable. It was the result of a series of failures that compounded over time. And while her story is one of heartbreak, it is also a call to action. Elisa's legacy demands that we do better, for her and for every child like her, because no child should ever have to wonder if the world is a safe place. To understand Elisa's story, we must first see where it unfolded. A small neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, filled with families seeking better lives. Yet within this bustling community lay an apartment that became a site of unimaginable horror. This was Elisa's world, a patchwork of hope and despair, joy and tragedy. And as we trace her journey, the locations become as much a part of her story as the people who inhabited them. These visuals remind us of the places and moments where intervention was possible but did not come, where decisions were made that altered the course of Elisa's life forever. Elisa's story is one of contrasts. Between the innocence of her laughter and the harsh realities she faced, between the hope of her dreams and the despair of her final days. November 22nd, 1995 was a day that would forever change the lives of those who knew Elisa and shake an entire community to its core. Elisa Izquierdo's story is one that leaves us with many questions. Questions about justice, accountability, and the systems meant to protect our most vulnerable. Her death sparked critical reforms like Elisa's law, but even with these changes, the question remains: was it enough? Have we truly learned from Elisa's tragedy, or do the cracks in our system still put children at risk today? We want to hear from you. Do you think the changes brought by Elisa's law were enough, or do you believe more needs to be done to ensure the safety of children like Elisa? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in keeping this conversation alive and pushing for continued progress. If Elisa's story has moved you as deeply as it has moved us, please take a moment to share your thoughts. By engaging in this conversation, you're helping to ensure that Elisa's legacy continues to inspire change. Together, we can honor her memory by holding systems accountable and protecting the children who need us most. This case is one of many that highlights the importance of vigilance, advocacy, and reform. If you found this story as heartbreaking and important as we did, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that uncover the truth, challenge the systems in place, and amplify the voices of those who can no longer speak for themselves. By subscribing, you'll join a growing community dedicated to learning, reflecting, and taking action. Together, we can shine a light on these stories and ensure they are never forgotten. Elisa's story doesn't end here, and neither does the fight to protect children at risk. If you want to take action, consider supporting organizations that work tirelessly to prevent child abuse and advocate for systemic reform. Every step we take, whether it's raising awareness, reporting concerns, or supporting advocacy, brings us closer to a world where no child's cry for help goes unheard. Elisa's life may have been cut short, but her legacy continues to inspire us to do better, to be better, for the children who need us the most. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to learn about Elisa Izquierdo's story. By listening, reflecting, and engaging, you're helping to ensure that her voice and the voices of countless others are never silenced. Together, we can create a future where stories like Elisa's are no longer possible. Elisa Izquierdo's story is not the only one that forces us to confront the failures of the systems designed to protect the vulnerable. Across the country, there are countless children whose voices go unheard, whose suffering remains unseen until it's too late. And while Elisa's tragedy prompted sweeping reforms, her story is just one chapter in a much larger book of heartbreak and lessons yet to be learned. In our next video, we'll uncover the story of another child, a young boy whose cries for help echoed through his community but fell on deaf ears. His case reveals chilling parallels to Elisa's, from the overlooked warning signs to the devastating outcome that shook his family and community to their core. How could this happen again? And what does it say about the systems we trust to protect our children? We'll explore the details of his life, the warning signs that were ignored, and the systemic failures that allowed his tragedy to unfold. Like Elisa, his story will challenge us to ask hard questions and demand better from the institutions meant to protect our most vulnerable. This case will take us deeper into the patterns of neglect and the cracks in our systems that continue to let children fall through. We'll delve into the decisions that sealed his fate, and hear from those who tried to intervene but were ultimately silenced by bureaucracy. And, just like Elisa's story, this one will leave you asking, how many more children must suffer before we create real, lasting change? If you've found Elisa's story as heartbreaking and important as we have, you won't want to miss our next video. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you'll ensure you're the first to hear about this next case, and others like it. Together, we can continue to shine a light on these stories and push for the change that is so desperately needed. We believe that awareness is the first step to action. By joining us for these stories, you're becoming part of a movement that refuses to look away, that demands answers, and that fights for a future where no child's cries for help are ignored. In our next video, we'll ask the question, how many warning signs are too many? How did this young boy's cries for help go unanswered, even as those around him tried to sound the alarm? And most importantly, what can we learn from his story to ensure it never happens again? We'll see you in the next episode, where we'll uncover another story that demands to be heard, remembered, and acted upon. Thank you for watching,